Thank you for taking time out of your day to join me for tree identification, part of the What's in My Backyard webinar series. Full disclosure, the tree on the slide is not actually in my backyard. This is a three-flowered maple and peak fall color that I photographed at the University of Illinois Arboretum. A little information on who I am and my role with the University of Illinois. I'm an extension specialist housed within inside Department of Crop Sciences. My primary responsibility is with the University of Illinois Pesticide Safety Education Program. This program produces educational materials and delivers programming to help prepare applicators for the Illinois Pesticide Certification exams. Aside from that, I also assist with a variety of other extension programs. I support the University of Illinois Plant Clinic with diagnostics and plant identification. And I also coordinate the Home Yard and Garden Pest newsletter, which many of you may be aware of. My particular areas of expertise lie within landscape horticulture, woody plant pathology, and woody plant identification. We unfortunately don't have anywhere near enough time to cover all the ins and outs of tree identification. Many universities, including the University of Illinois, offer 1 or 2 semester courses devoted to woody plant identification and use. With our limited time today, I plan to highlight features used in the identification process. I won't go into extreme detail on leaf features. That's because I would like you to look beyond the leaves at some of the other important characteristics. I'll also introduce some resources that are available for your use. How do you identify a tree that you have no previous knowledge about? Let's say you have a tree in your backyard. All you currently know about that tree is that it's tall, green, and it was probably planted by a previous homeowner or possibly a squirrel. You are curious to what species this tree is. Since you don't know anything about that tree, you need a tool that doesn't require any previous knowledge. That's where dichotomous keys come in handy. Dichotomous keys are tools used to identify unknown objects or organisms, and you may remember them from biology class. Dichotomous keys consist of a series of steps that narrow and lead you to the correct identification of an organism, in this case, a tree. Dichotomous means divided in 2 parts, so each step gives you 2 options. And on a side note, a well-written key has clearly distinct options at every step. While you don't need any previous knowledge of the plant to use a dichotomous tree key, you may need a good grasp of botanical terminology to navigate through it. Dichotomous keys also become increasingly complex as the number of species included within the key increases. While smaller keys may be easier to use, they may not include the tree species you are trying to identify. Lastly, they can be easy to get off track, especially if you guess or select options that you're not 100% sure on. Unfortunately, once off track, it's often difficult to recover. These are some of the plant features often used within tree identification keys. Taste, pest, and wood are not common, but I included them more for random trivia. A now long retired professor was rumored to chew on twigs to identify trees by their taste. I haven't tried to master that skill, nor do I plan to. Phil Nixon, a retired extension entomologist, would sometimes identify trees by the insects or insect pests that he found on them. Another presentation all in itself is identifying trees by their various wood features. It's challenging, but you can often narrow a wood sample down to a genus or subgroup by examining the detail within its grain. The other features are commonly used on plant identification keys as well as within the plant descriptions. To successfully identify a tree, you will need a high-quality sample with as many of these features present as possible. The more information or features provided, the better.
So a little more botanical terminology, or getting into a little more detail here. So several next slides, we'll go through some of that terminology that's used to kind of describe the various plant features used on these keys. I like to start with leaf arrangement, also referred to as phyllotaxy. This basically describes how the leaves are arranged on a plant's stem As we look at our keys, this will typically be maybe not necessarily the first step, but one of those first steps within inside that key. That's because these can often be grouped into 2 to 4 groups of plants. And being able to group that kind of eliminates a large number of plant species from consideration. So for example, if we know a plant is opposite, we only look at plants that are inside that group. So on the slide here are the 4 common groups of leaf or buds, if you just have buds on the stem at that time, leaf or bud arrangements. The majority of plants that we have in the landscape are alternate in arrangement. Then we kind of go that the second largest group would be opposite, then subopposite, and world. So when we look at a plant that has something referred to as an alternate arrangement, it essentially has 1 leaf or 1 bud per node, and they would alternate across the stem. The next group there is opposite, meaning there are 2 leaves or 2 buds per node, kind of directly adjacent from each other. A subgroup of that is something referred to as subopposite. So it's not directly adjacent to that previous bud, and it's not quite far enough away to be considered alternate either. So we'd refer to that as subopposite, and there are some plants that would fall into that group, including here we have a common buckthorn there. Also note, some plants may have both opposite and subopposite on the same plant. So once you see that, again, it's going to kind of narrow you into the few plants that would fall into that category. The last one we have in terms of leaf arrangement would be something referred to as world. We don't have a lot of trees or shrubs here in Illinois that would fall under that category. The best example we have is photographed here, and that's catalpa. And you'd have 3 or more buds or leaves per node. Now, you may all be familiar or remember the mnemonic device, Mad Horse, that was used to help remember some of the common trees that have an opposite arrangement to them. So in that mnemonic, MAD stands for maple, ash, and dogwood. And then the horse stands for horse chestnut. So those are some of the common trees that would fall under the opposite arrangement. Dr. Kling used this mad cap hip fellow with a princess as a mnemonic. And it's just basically an expansion of that mad horse. So with the expansion, we have Caprifoliaceae included in there. So that would include plants such as beauty bush, some of our honeysuckles, elderberries, viburnums. Those would all fall under that, inside that Caprifoliaceae family. He uses hip to basically signify the Hippocastaniaceae, which would again be some of those within the Aesculus or buckeye and horse chestnut family. The fellow is short for phellodendron for the amur cork tree. And then the last one there is princess for princess tree, Polonia tomentosa. So again, if we're trying to do an identify process, we see a plant that has an opposite arrangement, it could very likely fall within this group of plants. The mnemonic doesn't cover everything. These are some other plants that would be having that opposite arrangement that do not fall within inside that mnemonic device. So these are the ones that have opposite. And then on the right here, we have some sub-opposite leaf plants, including the Katsura tree, white fringe tree, some of our euonymus, privets, and again, that common buckthorn that we saw pictured in the previous slide. I did want to briefly mention that as you're using some of these keys, they will identify other leaf features. In the interest of time, I don't really want to go into details on all these. They're fairly self-explanatory. Durr's Manual of Woody Landscape Plants, which I cover later in this presentation, does contain a lot of helpful illustrated glossary terms to help kind of identify some of these characteristics. But in the short amount of time that we have, I do want to kind of spend some more time talking about bud and stem features. So as we look at buds, we can again kind of look at some of the typical characteristics that you would anticipate. Buds and stems, I should say, tend to be a little more distinctive than leaves alone. Leaves can be quite variable, even within inside the tree. So you could have a leaf that's more in a shaded location, have a completely different appearance than one more towards the end of branch that gets more light. So it's sometimes helpful to couple that with a bud and stem feature to help confirm the identity of that plant. So as we saw with some of those leaf tissues, we can describe buds based off of their size, color, shape. We can note some unique characteristics on the surface of that bud. So it might be pubescent, meaning it's covered in lots of short, soft hairs. There are some that can be quite shiny, like we have with our American sweet gums, and others that can be very sticky, like the horse chestnut is pretty well known for having a very sticky bud during the winter months. We also look at maybe how that bud sits in relation to the stem. So some may be oppressed or kind of very tightly, closely held to that stem. Others may be significantly more divergent. So in the photo at the top there, we have a Japanese Zelkova, which is noted for having buds that sit at a pretty distinct 45-degree angle from that stem. Some other things are looking at maybe how that terminal bud appears on that stem. In the bottom image, we have a hardy rubber tree, which actually is something referred to as a pseudo-terminal bud. So it's got a large bud, kind of makes it look like that's the terminal bud. And then there's a little bit of a peg that extends beyond it. In actuality, there's a very small axillary bud sort of in the top of that little peg there. So it is, again, a pseudo-terminal bud. And if you see that, it's probably likely that you're looking at, again, at a hardy rubber tree or Euphomia ulmoides. One thing that the keys that we'll kind of discuss later often will refer to are some of the scale arrangements and scale features. Bud scales are essentially tissues that protect the embryonic leaf tissues within the bud. They often described how they are arranged on that plant. So some examples include many of the plants we'll see might have something referred to as an imbricate bud. That means there are many or several scales that kind of tightly overlap and sort of resembles or kind of analogous to something like shingles on a roof. So in the photo on the far left here, we have an imbricate bud from an Ohio buckeye. We'd also see imbricate buds on oaks as well as beech trees. Another arrangement is referred to as valvate, which there are two parallel scales that meet and they generally don't overlap. And some of the common trees and shrubs here in Illinois that would have those would be maybe viburnum, as well as some of our alders and dogwood. Single scale, pictured second from the right there. That basically has one scale cover that sits over the top of the bud, sort of like a hat. We see that occur frequently on plants such as willows, sycamores, or plane trees. The last feature we want to cover there are naked buds, meaning there are no scales covering that bud. Essentially, it's just basically like a unformed leaf kind of going into that winter or dormant season. And if you look very closely in some of these naked buds, you can actually see some of the starting tissues within that particular leaf forming. So these could be some of those vein-like tissues. So it has something like a foliose type appearance to them. So again, some of our viburnums would have that, as well as our witch hazels and black walnuts. Some additional stem features to look at here would again include your basic thing where we look at color, pretty easy to kind of describe. You'll often see references look at the thickness of a stem. So it could be something that has kind of a fine stem or something more stout in appearance. Other features, you'd maybe see some presence of lenticels. Those are essentially pores on the surface of that stem. It can be very distinguishing, something that'll appear in a key. You might see something referring to fissures, which are sort of like lengthwise tears within the stem. Exfoliation is something quite common that you'll see described. Pubescence, again, some fine hairy surface, especially on some of that newer growth or even a waxy covering on there. Odor is a good one to use. Some trees have unique odors, especially when you kind of scratch or bruise some of those younger stem tissues. That was one thing Dr. Kling always told us to do, is if you're in a quiz, an ID quiz that he had where we'd go out and look at trees out in the natural landscape and have to identify them for a grade, he recommended if you're ever stuck to stop, scratch, and smell the stem. And some of them have a unique odor that might jar your memory and help you identify that plant. So a good example of that would be sweet birch, Betula lenta. That has a remarkable wintergreen aroma when you scratch that stem. And once you smell that, you automatically know what you have. Otherwise, the tree can be fairly difficult to identify. Pith is the last thing I want to mention on your stem tissue characteristic. Pith is the center of the stem. Some of them have some fairly unique colors inside there. So Kentucky coffee tree, for example, has a salmon colored pith. Other trees, it might not be solid pith throughout the entire stem. You might have portions of it that are sort of hollow or chambered, but these are, again, all clues that will help you lead to the identification of that tree, or may be useful as you're working your way through a key. Leaf scars. So as the leaves drop, they leave a little area on the stem. It's referred to as a scarring. Those can have unique shapes to them. So for example, here in the center there again, we have a hardy rubber tree with sort of a horseshoe-shaped leaf scar to it. Others, like this catalpa over here, has a very distinctive raised round leaf scar. And we also look at scarring, or basically remnants from the vascular bundle traces, which are kind of composed of some of the xylem and phloem tissues. And sometimes they'll have a fairly unique pattern left inside that stem. So on the far left here, as we look at the sweet gum, or Nyssa sylvatica, it commonly has these three distinctive vascular bundle traces. And that's one of the best features you have for it as you look into the winter month identification of that tree. Last botanical feature I want to cover this afternoon will be some of the stipule condition, or stipules and stipule scars. So essentially, stipules are basal appendages of the petiole. They're often present fairly early in the growing season, and as we get into the kind of late summer, or early late summer, they tend to kind of fall off that plant. So while they're there, they're useful features, but even after they fall off, they tend to leave a little bit of scarring, like we see on the right. We have a castanea in this, the Chinese chestnut in this image here, and that scarring can give you a clue as to what plant you're looking at. You'll likely come across some unknown terms as you use these keys. You're best not to just guess the answer on them. If you're unsure, you should probably try to look that up before proceeding. We'll have a couple of references. You can look at that, but oftentimes even a simple Google search or whatever browser you want to use to find that, you can type that in. It'll yield the definition as well as an image or illustration to help you work through that. So again, there's plenty of terms out there we cannot cover in our limited time. So I want to shift gears here. I'll mention a few tree identification resources that are available. There are plenty of tree ID keys out there. Hard decision will be selecting one that's within inside your comfort zone and kind of that fits what your current botanical knowledge is. So these books that the ones I'm going to cover in the next few slides, they're reliable resources. They've been around a lot longer than I have. They vary in their complexity and ease of use, as well as which plant features are used inside each reference. So I want to start by highlighting a fairly easy one to use. This one is Trees and Shrubs and Vines, a pictorial guide to the ornamental woody plants of northern US, and it says it's exclusive of conifers. I'm starting with this one. This one you only need to use a leaf sample to work your way through the key. It's easy to use, doesn't require extensive knowledge of botanical terminology, so it's kind of good for newcomers. And it has a lot of leaf illustrations within the publication, and they're organized by by the arrangement on the stem, whether or not it's a simple or compound leaf, and then again by whether it has toothed margins to it. Once you find the appropriate group, you eventually will compare your sample to photos or illustrations to, it would be actually an illustration to confirm your identity of the plant. So we're going to use this key to identify the leaf photographed in the left image there, or basically identify what tree it belongs to. So again, with a dichotomous key, we have two choices to make, and we'll start working our way, beginning with A. So in this case here, it's essentially asking us, is the tree broadleafed or needled? Well, we know it's broadleafed, so we'd select that and move on to B. That step, it's asking us the arrangement. Is it alternate or opposite? You can't tell that from the photo here, so this is where I'm going to kind of step in. I know that this happens to have an opposite arrangement. If you do happen to have a sample to you, the more information, the better. You'll be able to identify that it was, in fact, opposite. So we answer B, we would then go to the next group below that, which would be inside C here. Looking at the sample here, we know we have a compound leaf. So that tells us we need to then go to the photographs for species 401 through 432. So we got about 32 potential possibilities to compare illustrations to. Fortunately, I picked a good example here. As we begin at 401, that's actually the sample that most matches our illustration, so we don't need to look any further. And we have our tree, Aesculus glabra, or the Ohio buckeye. So again, it's a fairly easy key to work your way through. Didn't require very much of any botanical terminology. Now, hopefully the plant sample you'll be working with has a lot more features, including buds and stems. Again, buds tend to provide you with a more uniform and distinctive identification for that tree. So as you get more features, you can use some other types of resources. This is a pretty popular one, or one that I use fairly frequently. Forgive me if I say this wrong, but this is Muncher's Keys to Woody Plants. And it basically provides an expanded guide for native and cultivated species. While the previous reference was fairly simple and easy to use, you can note here that this one contains nearly double the amount of species. I believe that previous one had about 600 pictures within it. This one's almost up to 1,200. So again, as you add more species, it's going to require a more complex key, and they're going to have to add in some more extensive botanical terminology to be able to separate out the different trees. Also note, this one doesn't have any photos or illustrations, so it's not going to be kind of a standalone. You'll eventually need an additional resource to go back and compare and verify that you do in fact have that correct identification. We'll do a similar exercise as we did with the previous reference. So let's try to identify this leaf as well as bud using this Keys to Woody Plants. Similar to what we did before, we'll start by answering the first questions in the list there, which are A, wants to know if we have leaf present or absent. We do have those there. So we can go down to B, wants again to know if we have needles or broadleaves. We again have a broadleaf. There it goes again, asking if we have an opposite or alternate. We know we have opposite. And then it wants to know if we have simple or compound leaves, and we have compound. So when we got that far, it tells us to go to key 3 on page 21. So here we are on there. Wants us to count how many leaflets in step 1. We know we have more than 3, so we go down to that second option there. Asks us whether or not we have a palmately compound or pinnately compound leaf. This is a palmately compound leaf. And again, we're looking at whether the features in there, kind of comparing that, and wants to know how many leaflets we have what shape they are, and based off that information in there, we do select that we have a member of the Aesculus genre, or a member of the Aesculus genus. Your next step on this particular reference would be then to go to the keys to species. And since we identified this as an Aesculus, we'd go to that key. They're arranged alphabetically towards the back of the reference. And we again start the process over. Questions ask us, is the bud really kind of gummy or sticky? No. So we move on to the next one. It happens to be smooth, dry, and again talks about the leaflets there. So we check that, move on to the third option, ask us some characteristics about that particular stem that we have there. We note that the buds are elongated, have a urcurinate apex to them. And that basically describes them as having an abrupt, minute point. So if you look very closely at these buds, it kind of comes up to a very fine, small point, and that'd be that urcurinate type apex to that bud scale. The last thing in there would be talking about some of the fruit, not the fruit, the twig. Again, if you crush and smell the stem on this one, it should have kind of a strong, fetid, or unpleasant odor to it. And that's, again, kind of help you with your diagnosis or your confirmation of this. As an Illinois graduate, I do want to take a moment just to highlight the fact that this is proof that the Ohio Buckeyes do stink. Sorry if we have any Ohio State grads. Next reference is the tree identification book. It's another easy to use reference. It has a lot of great pictures within inside it. Those will cover basically some of the leaves, flowers, fruits, stems, and barks. They've got keys for each of those. Easy to use, doesn't require very much botanical knowledge. One of the drawbacks to this is it is sort of limited to sort of your native and a few naturalized plant species. So any of those non-natives, you might not be covered with inside this reference. Just kind of a quick look at the contents and how, again, breaks it down. We can see on the right there how you can quickly shift to the appropriate part within inside that manual. And it ranges them from plants that have opposite arrangement. You can identify it after the thorns, leaves, flowers, fruits, twigs, buds, barks, and if you have some needled plant material. Some of the photos inside, they're black and white, but they're pretty good resolution and should be fairly helpful in kind of isolating and identifying that plant you have in front of you. Last one. Actually, I got two more, but this one here, Woody Plants in Winter, is a manual of common trees and shrubs in winter in the Northeast United States and Southeastern Canada. It's an old one, 1958, written by Corin Evans. It mostly contains native as well as a few introduced species. Being a winter reference, you're not going to find anything about leaves inside this. You might have some fruits or flower parts that persist into winter. They might mention those within the keys, but it's really meant to be used for that dormant season where a lot of those leaves are not going to be present. Does require a fairly moderate amount of botanical terminology in order to navigate through this one. And I just got one page to show you inside here as part of that reference. Again, a moderate botanical knowledge is needed here. There's nothing in here that's too complicated. You see a word superposed up there. That essentially describes when you have an accessory or smaller bud above the true lateral bud. And if you go down to, I believe, 229, which got cut off on this one, also, well, 228 covers superimposed, but there's also reference in here for, oh, here it is, stipule scars. So how I mentioned that previously in some of our characteristics, those will work their way into here as well. This is the last book reference I had. I don't have any pages, photographs of pages from the inside of this, but it's another one that's available as fruit key and twig key to trees and shrubs. The fruit key is fairly easy to follow and understand, while the twig key gets a little more complex and again would require more botanical knowledge to it. I do want to highlight that most of these are still available. So even though they were originally printed or published many, many years ago, they are still frequently used and they are being reprinted on a regular basis. So I've checked Amazon and other web retailers. They do have these available, including some of the reprints. So if you're interested in these, you can find them. And I believe I have the references towards the back of the slideshow here. We can get them to you as well. So after you've keyed out the plant, you still need a reference with additional detailed descriptions and, if possible, some high quality photos to compare your sample with what you believe to be that tree. It's just kind of a confirmation of your identification. So I have two quick examples of some manuals out there that are, or resources that are available. First here is Durr's Manual of Woody Landscape Plants. It's one of my most frequently used references. This book happens to be in its 6th edition, and I think it came out in 2009. And between the editions, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger as he adds in additional plant material. Interesting, in this edition, they had to use some thinner paper. It's almost like a phone book type paper in order to squeeze as many pages as they needed to into that reference. Previous edition had a brown cover to it, and many in the green industry essentially referred to it as the Brown Bible of woody plant material. So inside, it's going to contain lots of line drawings of leaves, buds, stems, extensive information on various species and cultivars underneath them, as well as excellent descriptions of leaves, buds, stems, and other fruit features. As I mentioned in the beginning, this also includes an illustrated glossary of things such as the leaf morphology, bud morphology, and other characteristics as well. So if you get some of those terms you're confused on, you can go to that reference and look those up. Drawback is this is not a key. So theoretically, if I had that sample, I can thumb through this. It's got several hundred pages, over 1,000 pages to it. So it would take me a while to match that leaf up to the illustration. So this is really for something when you know or suspect you know what it is, that's when you're able to go and find that. It is arranged in order by alphabetic order by botanical name. Another one that I use probably more frequently than that Durr manual is Dr. Gary Kling's U of I Plants website. He essentially created a database with lots of his photos, high quality photos, and it contains a lot of the same information that's covered within the Durr manual. It's just kind of easier to access and much quicker to access in some cases using this web utility here. As we see on the slide here, he'll start off each page with little information on the habit of that tree, including some of the size, where it's able to grow, what family it belongs to. And then as you navigate through each of these links here, it gives you photos and descriptions of all those characteristics. So on the left there, we can see here the Ohio Buckeye as a nice picture of the flower and description as well. This is also one that has a drop-down menu in order by genus, so you kind of have to know the botanical name. However, you're unsure of that, you can click on that advanced search option and also search by common names. Looks like I'm going a bit over time here, but it's a lot of information to cover in a short presentation here. So I just had a couple more things I wanted to point out to you. There are some apps available, quite useful. Many of you may be familiar with PlantSnap, one of the original ones to be introduced. This is available on, I think, both Apple and Android devices, one of the more famous ones. It has a free version, which has ads to it, so that can be a little bit annoying, but it also gives you about 25 snaps or IDs per day. If you want to use more than that and get rid of those ads, you have to use their premium version. So this will identify more than just trees. It'll go into flowers, succulents, it says mushrooms, cacti. So it's quite useful. I've only tested it a few times. I don't have extensive experience with it. I was impressed with how well it worked for certain types of plants. It did seem to have a little trouble with some of the evergreens as I tried to identify a false cypress. Those needles are fairly small, so maybe that's part of the reason why. but on some of the other broadleaf, it was very quick and very accurate. Probably gonna put me out of a job. It did have trouble identifying this wafer ash. As I basically took the snap of this, it came back telling me it was poison ivy. So that's my hand holding it the other day in the left image. So let's hope I was correct and the app was wrong. Interesting thing about this plant here, wafer ash, is actually part of the citrus family. So if anybody's familiar with giant swallowtails, they basically primarily feed on citrus plants. And they can be a devastating pest in citrus areas within our country. But this ash happens to be one of the few food plants for that species that naturally grows in Illinois. Last app I want to cover is actually one produced by Virginia Tech. It's a V-tree, Virginia Tech tree identification. They don't describe this as a key or a dichotomous key. They describe it as a tool that has an interview process, and that's because each step contains more than 2 options. So it's not a true dichotomous key. Now, as you open the app, it's again available on Apple, Android, and also as a web browser. So you don't necessarily have to have that smartphone to use it. As you begin the process, it'll ask you if you want to do a basic ID interview, which just answers some simple questions, doesn't require that technical knowledge. And then it'll ask you if you want to do an advanced interview. Gives a little warning there that you might need a little more knowledge for that. My best advice would probably be just to skip that basic interview. When I tried it, it provided far too many matching species and then suggested I go ahead to the advanced interview anyway. A couple of slides on this. Again, there's the interview options. Ask you whether you have a tree, shrub, a bramble, rose, vine. Select the one that best matches your plant. It asks where would this species be growing? And that's where I want to highlight that as you're using this, you definitely don't want to just guess. If you're unsure, click skip question, because if you get it wrong, it's probably going to eliminate the plant that you're looking for from its a matrix for possibilities. So again, skip questions, it'll still work its way out for you. Then the next step would ask you again if you have those needles, broadleaves, probably not a cactus here in Illinois. And finally, after answering all the questions, it usually gets you down to maybe about 20, maybe fewer species if you're lucky. And you would again compare your sample that you have in front of you to these various fact sheets that come available with that plant. And as you enter those, they'll give you more detailed descriptions of the features in there, as well as some nice photos. So that's a good app to try. It's not as quick as you would have with Plant Snap. It is free, and it gives you a little more exercise as you're trying to identify that tree. I do want to close out this presentation. My last tip for you in terms of help you with your identification of trees is if all else fails, try pie. And there's a story behind this. I can honestly say that pie has helped me identify a plant sample in the past. The story is that somebody dropped off a sample at the U of I plant clinic for identification. So that's something they do as part of their sample submission. This particular client had traveled to a southern state for work, and while they were there, they noticed a tree that they were kind of interested in. So they picked up a leaf and one of the fruits and brought it home with them. They dropped it off as a sample, probably sat there for a while, because by the time I got it, it was sort of partially decayed. The fruit was kind of black. Everything, it wasn't a very high quality sample that we would use typically. So it was in poor condition. We can identify some unique features in it, but not enough for us to actually give a reliable identification. So where does pie come in? Well, I happen to be at a pie shop in Dallas, Texas, or one of the suburbs there, enjoying pie. Probably, I think I was in this chair here, when I looked up and saw this botanical print that they had hanging on the wall. And that matched that sample perfectly. It had arcuate venation, so the leaf veins kind of curve up towards the apex of that tree, the leaf. The fruit we had sort of had a very thick outer layer to it, and then inside had that more kind of hard, solid center. And that basically matched the sample perfectly. So I snapped a picture of it, and it turns out they must have been pretty far south because it's probably some type of nutmeg that they had brought to us. And those are hardy to zone 10, 11, and not something we'd expect to come across or for me to have previous knowledge here in Illinois. So again, if all else fails, try pie. Those are some of the photos you saw in this presentation, especially those close-up of the features. Those are credited to Dr. Gary Kling. He's got some excellent on his website. If you got to have permission to use them though, because they are copyrighted. And then the reference materials are all listed there as well. The ones at least that I provided to you inside this presentation.